Can someone be both visible and invisible? If you've watched any documentaries about disabled people or homeless people, that is something they often say. People may pass them by every single day, but never really notice them or see them. Sometimes they are treated as non-persons, completely ignored and invisible. At other times they are harassed and insulted, and sometimes they are nothing more than objects of pity. To be treated like this over a period of time affects how people see their own worth. This is true in the 21st century, and it was true in the 1st century. To be disabled in 1st century Israel was to be totally reliant on the kindness or even pity of strangers to even be able to survive. There was no such thing as disability rights or meaningful employment. Most disabled people had to suffer the humiliation of begging for a living. Bartimaeus was one of those visible and yet invisible people. We read about him in Mark chapter 10. He was blind, and every day he sat by the side of the road begging for pennies from those who were passing by. Begging was a miserable existence, a daily humiliation, but he had no choice. If he didn't beg, he wouldn't eat. The beggar chose, or was more likely led, somewhere very visible to try and gain maximum exposure, because the more people that pass you by hopefully will translate into more coins being thrown. But no matter how visible a beggar is, he becomes used to being a person on the sidelines. Life is happening all around the beggar, and he sits there, visible and yet almost invisible, the object of some people's pity and of others' scorn. He comes briefly into the consciousness of those who pass by and toss him a few pennies, and then he's forgotten. Those few coins being tossed become a symbol of his worth. Just a small change from somebody's purse, that's how his worth is measured. This was the life of Bartimaeus. Bartimaeus was used to being ignored and invisible, but when he heard that Jesus of Nazareth was passing by, then something clicked in his mind. This was the opportunity of a lifetime, and he was determined to be noticed by Jesus. This was actually going to be Jesus' last journey through Jericho, because he was on his final journey to Jerusalem and to the cross. But Bartimaeus didn't know that. Even so, he was treating this occasion as if it was his very last chance to meet Jesus. He had heard so many amazing stories of what Jesus had done for others, and he knew that this was his chance, probably his one and only chance to ask Jesus to do something for him. He was so determined not to miss his opportunity that he certainly made his presence felt. What would you have done in that situation? Would you have kept your decorum? Would you have called out politely? Maybe you wouldn't have wanted to cause a scene. Bartimaeus was used to humility and not causing a scene in public. His whole existence as a beggar demanded daily humility. But what happens when humility collides with desperation? For Bartimaeus, when humility and desperation collided, he knew that on this day he couldn't afford to be a person on the sidelines. He couldn't afford to be that invisible person for once in his lifetime. In his desperation, he knew that somehow or other he needed to gain the attention of Jesus amid all the tumult and crowds that were round about. So he decided to throw decorum and caution to the wind, and he began to shout at the top of his voice, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." In a culture that generally overlooked and ignored those who were in any way disabled, he knew that he would have to be persistent if he was going to gain Jesus' attention. The crowds did not like it. They told him to shut up in no uncertain terms, but he refused. This was his chance. Today was the best chance he was ever going to have to meet Jesus. Bartimaeus refused to be silenced by the critics, by those who objected to his persistent shouts, and he was noticed by Jesus. Do you think it was only the loudness of his shouts that brought him to the attention of Jesus? I think it was more than that. I think it was the desperation of his heart. Jesus said in John chapter 5 verse 19 that he could only do what he saw his Father doing. Oh, you are the God who sees me. Remember yesterday? There may have been many people shouting that day to get Jesus' attention, but Jesus sees the heart. He sees the desperation. And Jesus saw what the Father was doing that day on the roadside in Jericho. Jesus called for Bartimaeus, and he was brought over to Jesus. Jesus simply said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" Bartimaeus didn't waste a second in replying, "I want to see." In that moment, his sight was restored. He received the desire of his heart and he followed Jesus. Is there a longing and a desperation in your heart today to meet Jesus? Or are you thinking, I'll have another opportunity, I'll have another chance? How do you know that? How do you know that today may be your last chance to meet Jesus? He is the one who can open your spiritual eyes. He is the one who can change your life from the inside out and make you into a brand new person. Today might be your last opportunity to meet Jesus. Is there a cry of desperation rising up from deep within your heart? Have you decided that you don't want to sit on the sidelines anymore, visible and yet somehow invisible? You want to see. You want to get up and follow Jesus more than any one thing in your life. Today, if this is the cry rising from your heart, Jesus sees you. He hears you and he calls you to himself.